September 12, 1942. Guadalcanal. When Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson learned that 20,500 Japanese troops were moving to surround his 800 Marines, he faced a choice that would define not just this battle, but the entire character of the Pacific War. Retreat, as every manual prescribed, or trust in something the textbooks couldn't quantify: preparation, discipline, and the fighting spirit of U.S. Marines. Edson chose to stand. He ordered his men to tighten their defensive perimeter and let the enemy come. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was proof that superior training and leadership could overcome any numerical disadvantage, and that Americans would not be driven from ground they chose to hold. On a jungle ridge barely 60 feet high, 800 exhausted Marines waited in the dark. They were outnumbered 3-1, low on ammunition, surrounded on 3 sides. Every rule of warfare said they were already dead. Retreat was impossible. Fall back and you'd expose Henderson Field to Japanese artillery. Reinforcements were days away, if they came at all. And yet, instead of pulling back to more defensible ground, Lieutenant Colonel Red Mike Edson gave an order no manual would ever recommend. Tighten the perimeter. Pull every man back to the ridge itself. Let the enemy come closer. Let them surround us completely. In the humid silence of Guadalcanal's jungle night, 2,500 Japanese soldiers moved through the darkness, confident they would deliver a killing blow to the American position. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had planned this assault for weeks. 3 converging columns, synchronized night attacks, overwhelming force against demoralized defenders. His intelligence reports assured him the Marines were on the verge of collapse, weakened by malaria and malnutrition, their morale shattered by weeks of isolation in hostile jungle. One final push would sweep them from the ridge and open the path to Henderson Field. What the Japanese didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that this ridge had been transformed into something far more dangerous than it appeared. Every approach had been measured and registered for artillery fire. Fields of fire had been meticulously cleared through the undergrowth. Machine guns had been positioned to create interlocking kill zones that would turn jungle trails into death traps. And the Marines themselves, despite their exhaustion and dwindling supplies, had been trained for exactly this kind of fight, disciplined defensive warfare that would make the enemy pay in blood for every yard they advanced. What followed that night was not a heroic last stand, but one of the most devastating defensive victories in Marine Corps history. A battle that would prove numerical superiority meant nothing against superior preparation. A battle that would shatter Japanese assumptions about American fighting capability and mark the beginning of a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. This is the story of how 800 Marines held ground they had every reason to abandon, and annihilated an enemy force 3 times their size. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. To understand why this ridge mattered, you need to understand what was at stake in the fall of 1942. Guadalcanal wasn't just another island in the vast Pacific. It was the hinge upon which the entire war could turn. For 8 months, Japan had swept across the Pacific unchecked, seizing territory with a speed that shocked Allied commanders. But on this obscure island in the Solomon Chain, that momentum had finally stalled. The reason was Henderson Field. The airstrip sat like a dagger pointed at Japan's southern supply routes. American fighters and bombers operating from Henderson could interdict Japanese convoys, harass their bases, and provide air cover for Allied naval operations. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the surrounding seas. Whoever controlled the seas would ultimately control the Pacific. Both sides understood this with perfect clarity, which meant both sides would pay any price to hold or capture that single stretch of coral runway. And all that stood between Henderson Field and Japanese artillery was a nameless ridge barely worthy of being called a hill. Edson's Ridge, though it hadn't earned that name yet, rose perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding jungle. A low spine of coral and volcanic rock stretching roughly 1,000 yards north to south. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't even particularly defensible by conventional standards, but it commanded the southern approaches to Henderson Field, and that made it invaluable. Lose the ridge, and Japanese observers could direct artillery fire onto the airstrip. Lose the ridge, and enemy infantry could advance close enough to launch direct assaults on the field's perimeter. Lose the ridge, and Henderson Field would become untenable. The Marines defending this critical ground were in no condition to fight a major battle. They'd been on Guadalcanal for over a month, and the island was destroying them by degrees. Malaria burned through the ranks, leaving men shaking with fever in their fighting holes. Dysentery was so common it barely rated mention. Rations were reduced to 2 meals a day, and those meals consisted of whatever could be scrounged from dwindling supplies. Men who'd arrived weighing 180 pounds now carried 155 on their frames, their uniforms hanging loose, their faces hollowed by hunger and disease. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies were running out. Replacement parts for weapons were non-existent. The Marines made do with what they had because there was nothing else to be done. Japanese intelligence knew all this. Their reconnaissance had documented the deteriorating condition of American forces. Radio intercepts suggested collapsing morale. Captured documents revealed supply shortages that should have rendered the Marine position untenable. Major General Kawaguchi planned his assault with the confidence of a commander who believed he was delivering a coup de grace to an already beaten enemy. One sharp blow, his staff assured him, and the Americans would break. They were too weak, too isolated, too demoralized to mount effective resistance against a determined night assault by superior forces. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. While Japanese forces prepared for what they believed would be a straightforward assault, the Marines were building something their enemy couldn't see, a killing ground disguised as vulnerable terrain. Edson understood that the ridge's apparent weakness was actually its greatest strength, but only if properly prepared. For a week before the battle, his Marines had transformed the jungle approaches into a carefully designed death trap. They cleared fields of fire through the dense undergrowth, creating open zones that would expose attacking forces to concentrated fire while offering no cover. Every tree, every bush, every fold in the ground that might provide concealment to advancing infantry was systematically removed within 300 yards of the defensive line. But clearing fields of fire was just the beginning. Forward observers spent days measuring exact distances to key terrain features: that cluster of trees at 400 yards, the ravine at 600, the trail junction at 800. These coordinates were meticulously recorded and transmitted to the artillery batteries at Henderson Field and the mortar crews positioned behind the ridge. When the battle came, Marine gunners wouldn't be firing blind into darkness. They would be dropping high-explosive shells onto pre-registered killing zones with surgical precision. The machine guns were positioned with equal care. Gunnery Sergeant John Basiloni, a veteran who'd served in the Philippines before the war, supervised the placement of every Browning M1917. Each weapon was sighted to cover specific approach routes, their fields of fire overlapping to create interlocking zones where no attacker could advance without entering multiple kill zones simultaneously. Basiloni had fought long enough to understand that machine guns didn't just need good positions. They needed ammunition reserves, clear fields of fire, and crews trained to maintain discipline under pressure. "A machine gun is only as good as the man behind it," Basiloni told his crews as they test-fired their weapons and calculated traverse limits. "And you're only as good as your preparation." The Marine Corps had trained its men for exactly this kind of warfare. Unlike the rigid top-down command structures common in other armies, Marine doctrine emphasized independent small-unit action. Squad leaders and fire team commanders were taught to make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from above. When formations broke down in the chaos of combat, and they always broke down, individual Marines could continue fighting effectively, adapting to circumstances, exploiting opportunities. Private First Class Robert Mard represented the newest generation of this doctrine. Just 3 weeks on Guadalcanal, but already the training was taking hold. He knew his rifle's capabilities, understood his position in the defensive scheme, and had been drilled endlessly on what to do when, not if, things went wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red Mike" Edson moved through these preparations with the calm focus of a craftsman perfecting his work. His reputation had been earned in Nicaragua and China, leading Marines in small unit actions where leadership and tactical flexibility mattered more than numerical superiority. He understood that courage alone wouldn't win this fight. Preparation would, training would, and the discipline to execute under pressure would. By September 12th, when intelligence confirmed that Kawaguchi's force was moving into position, Edson's Marines were as ready as exhausted, undersupplied troops could be. The ridge didn't look like a fortress, but appearances could be deceiving. The Japanese were about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way imaginable. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to WW2 Archives Declassified. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. The jungle erupted at 2130 hours. The first wave of Japanese infantry burst from the tree line with the traditional battle cry that had terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific, a rising chorus of voices meant to overwhelm American defenders with sheer psychological force. Kawaguchi's men charged uphill through the darkness, bayonets fixed, confident that speed and shock would carry them through the Marine positions before the Americans could mount effective resistance. They made it exactly 800 yards before Basiloni's machine gun opened fire. The Browning's heavy .30 caliber rounds cut through the advancing formations like industrial machinery processing human flesh. Basiloni fired in controlled bursts, traversing the gun smoothly across his designated sector, each burst sending 5 to 7 rounds downrange in less than 2 seconds. At this range, every round that found its mark was lethal. Japanese soldiers stumbled and fell, their momentum broken, their formations dissolving into chaos as follow-on waves collided with the casualties ahead. Then the other machine guns joined in. The interlocking fields of fire that Edson had designed transformed the jungle approaches into overlapping kill zones. No matter which route the Japanese chose, they advanced into the fire of multiple weapons. No matter where they sought cover, another gun could engage them. The doctrine was simple and devastating. Create zones where the enemy cannot advance without dying. The first mortar rounds began falling 30 seconds later. Marine crews, working from pre-registered coordinates, dropped high-explosive shells with mechanical precision onto the approach routes. The jungle floor erupted in fountains of coral fragments and steel shrapnel that scythed through tightly packed infantry formations. Men who'd survived the machine gun fire found themselves caught in explosions that killed in expanding circles of fragmentation. Then Henderson Field's artillery spoke. The 105 cm howitzers had been waiting with shells loaded and firing solutions calculated. Forward observers called in corrections by radio, adjusting fire onto concentrations of Japanese troops attempting to regroup in the jungle below. Each shell created a lethal radius across 40 yards, and the guns were firing 4 rounds per minute. The mathematical result was carnage on an industrial scale. The Japanese doctrine that had worked so effectively against unprepared enemies collapsed under sustained, accurate fire. The banzai charge depended on closing quickly to negate superior firepower, but the Marines had learned to engage at ranges where Japanese infantry couldn't effectively return fire. Kawaguchi's men found themselves dying in the darkness, unable to see their enemies, unable to close the distance, unable to do anything except absorb casualties and continue forward because their doctrine left no alternative. The second wave attacked. The machine guns cut them down. The third wave attacked. Artillery shattered their formations before they could organize. The fourth wave attacked. Mortar fire caught them in the killing zones and turned jungle trails into corridors filled with bodies. What had been planned as a swift night assault ground into brutal attrition. Japanese soldiers advanced over the bodies of their comrades, pressing forward with suicidal courage that accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty count. The Americans didn't panic, didn't break, didn't retreat. They simply